Hello, friends. Today's chapter of the day is Daniel chapter 2. And Daniel chapter 2, like every chapter of Scripture, is important and useful to us because it's Scripture. And there are some important things happening in the story of Scripture and in the prophecy that's included. But it's also important, Daniel chapter 2 is, in a literary sense, because something really interesting happens in Daniel chapter 2, verse 4. And what happens for the first time in the Old Testament, and the only time, is the text switches from being written in Hebrew, the language of the Jewish people, to being written in Aramaic. So, Aramaic is the language that Jesus would have spoken, and one of the languages that Jesus would have spoken. And it's a language that's being spoken in Babylon as this is transpiring. So from Daniel chapter 2, verse 4, all the way through chapter 7, that original scripture is written in the language of Aramaic. So kind of an interesting note. You read chapter 4 and you see that it specifically says, the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. And it's not just part of the story, but it's way the story is actually recorded. So that's an interesting thing. But as for what's happening in Daniel chapter 2, this is Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. And Nebuchadnezzar has this dream and calls in the magicians and the enchanters and the sorcerers, all these people who claim to have supernatural powers, and says to them, now he's kind of getting initiated. He's kind of the new king, and he's kind of testing out his advisors to see if he needs to clean some house. But he says to them, I want you to interpret the dream, but I'm not going to know whether you interpret it right. However, I am going to know if you tell me what the dream was. So I want you to tell me what the dream was so that I know you're authentic, and then interpret it for me. And all these sorcerers and enchanters and magicians who've been playing tricks on him and on the other kings for their whole career to get people to believe that they have supernatural powers, come in and say, verse 10, there's not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand. In other words, these people who claim supernatural powers are saying, how could we ever know something that you didn't tell us? All we can do is make up explanations. Don't you know that's our powers? So that's what the backstory is. And as a result of this, the king decides that they are all going to be killed. All of his advisors are going to be killed. Verse 12. Well, that includes Daniel and his companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's their Babylonian names. Their original names are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So Daniel, when he gets the word that he's going to be killed because the advisors can't answer the king in verse 16, he asks that the king gives him a time to interpret this dream. And he asks before he has the answer. And immediately after that request is granted, Daniel goes into prayer. And we see Daniel's prayer. And we see Daniel's response, particularly in verse 23. And in that response, he says, to you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and you have made known to me what we've asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. So Daniel walks in, the guy that, sort of the guy that's supposed to kill Daniel tries to take credit in verse 25. Hey, I found this guy. Well, he didn't find Daniel. Daniel had already been part of the king's circle of advisors. And Daniel begins by reminding the king in verse 27, no wise man, no enchanter, no magician, no astrologer can show the king what you're asking for. But here's the key, verse 28. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. So what's Daniel doing with his revelation? Is he using it to puff himself up, show the king how spiritual he is or how wise he is? No, he's using it to point to God. And what is this dream? This dream that the king has? Well, the king has this dream about the future because, the people of Israel are under the reign of Babylon. They're under this kingdom. And God shows the king the future of the kingdoms of the world. And in a sense, he's saying, as time goes on, kingdoms are going to get less and less powerful. They might be bigger, but the power is going to be spread out. And Nebuchadnezzar, the focus of this, is one of the most powerful kings in history because he's ruling this thing solely. And God is showing the king that that's going to continue to decline. And that's kind of the message of Daniel. When we put people in charge of things, they're going to get worse and worse and worse because people are evil. But what does God do? God's going to intervene. And at the end of this, verse 44, and in the days of those kings, so after this thing has deteriorated significantly, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom. So when human kingdoms fail, God's going to set up his kingdom. When it's been made clear that humans cannot govern rightly, God comes in and takes over. And that's what we're all looking forward to. And that kingdom of heaven will never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. So there are people who believe that this dream has been fulfilled, that all of this has already happened. And it is certainly in dispute whether some of the things forecasted in Daniel's prophecy have already happened. I think there's pretty clear evidence that is pointing to kingdoms that followed. Like the Romans, we believe, are part of this, this statue that the king sees. However, verse 44 has not been fulfilled yet. We're looking forward to the time when God's going to come back and he's going to reign, he's going to make everything right. And all the things that are wrong with this world because humans have been trying to govern it are going to be cleared up, because we're going to have a God who reigns in justice and kindness and righteousness and goodness. And we get to be with him. So, we see this in verse 47, from the lips of Nebuchadnezzar, truly your God is a God of gods and Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. Let us remember that today. With all the political dysfunction going on in the world, we worship if we're believers. If you're a believer, you worship the God of God and the Lord of lords, the one who's over all politics, all government, and the one who's going to make it all right someday. We are not a people without hope, but we are people with a perfect hope in a perfect God. So walk away encouraged. God has promised us it's all going to be made right. And when God makes a promise, he fulfills it. God bless you all, and I hope you're enjoying reading through Daniel.